Welcome, everyone. I'm Jason Wise, the Regional Development Lead for the Northwestern United States, coming to you from my hometown of Seattle. Welcome to today's joint NR Capital Matters NR Plus call. Few comments before we get started. Many of you NR Plus members may not be familiar with National Review Institute. We are the 501c3 journalistic think tank that was founded in 1991 to complement the mission of National Review. In August of 2015, we took ownership of National Review. We support National Review in many ways. We share joint offices in New York City on West 44th Street. A number of the top writers at National Review, we've made fellows of the Institute. We have a variety of programs that we run across the country. We do regional partnership events. We have a mid-career professional dinner seminar series on conservative thought called Burke to Buckley, currently runs in 5 cities. We actually have a virtual version of that program that we're running right now. The showcase event of our year is our William F. Buckley Prize Dinner. This year's prize dinner is going to be held in Dallas on October 21st. I hope that you will consider joining us there. I also want to make a plea for your support. Our fiscal year ends on July 31st. For a very reasonable $250 donation, you can have 12 months of our additional virtual programming at NRI. That includes our popular book and movie clubs. Our book clubs have talked about Richard Brookhiser's books on liberty, John Marshall. We've looked at Bill Buckley's Up from Liberalism and the Unmaking of a Mayor. This calendar year, we've talked to Douglas Murray about his book, The Madness of Crowds. And most recently in April, Jay Nordlinger led us through a discussion of the essential writings of George Orwell, including 1984 and Animal Farm. Our movie club is led by Armand White, Kevin Williamson, and Kyle Smith. They've looked at movies ranging from the classic Casablanca to this year's Oscars, as well as genres like dystopian films, gangster films, war movies, and Cold War movies. Today's call, we're going to talk about inflation. We got a very timely number this morning. The May CPI, Consumer Price Index, was up 5% year over year. The gas index was up over 50%. Our guest is Kevin Hassett. He's an NR Capital Matters Senior Advisor. He was chairman of Trump's Council of Economic Advisors. He's currently a distinguished visiting fellow at the Hoover Institute. He's a vice president at the Lindsay Group. He'll be in discussion with Rich Lowry and our editor-in-chief. Rich and Kevin will talk for about 40 minutes, and then we'll take questions for about 15 minutes. Please submit your questions through the chat function. Go to the bottom of your Zoom screen, and you can type in your questions there. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Rich Lowry.
Thanks so much, Jason. Yeah, so we have this number that made this call even more relevant than ever. And that's all we care about, Kevin, right? It's not the health of the country or the economy. It's whether our webinars are newsy or not. And unfortunately, this one is. So let's start really basic for the economic ignoramuses who might be part of this call. And I number myself among them. And let me say, by the way, as Jason said, just feel free at any time to go into the chat box and suggest questions, and I'll try to get to all the questions that I can. But Kevin, let's start real basic. What is inflation?
Yeah, well, inflation would be really easy to measure if we, basically only ate, say, bananas. So what inflation really is an increase in the price of the things that you need to buy so that you can have your life. It's certainly consumer inflation. That's what it is. Of course, we could have a whole seminar, and I know, Rich, you're going to sign up already, right? Because we could go to the blackboard and think about, well, what does it mean? The stuff I eat. You could think about all the things I ate last year, and then assume I try to eat the same exact bundle I had last year, this year, and then look at the prices of all of those. And then weight the prices, take a weighted average based on what I ate last year. Or you could look at what I bought this year and look at how much I paid, and then take a weighted average of the price increases relative to last year using this year's weights. Or you could do a whole bunch of different things. I know we've already just lost 50 people, but the point is, measuring inflation is a little tricky. But what the Consumer Price Index does is, with like absolutely gold standard science, they come up with the best estimate of what's happening to the average price of the stuff that Americans buy in order to have their ordinary lives. And right now, today we got a number which was like fully expected. If you've been reading John Cochran and me at National Review, Capital Matters, we started talking about this quite a while ago. Inflation is heading back towards where it was in the 70s. We've got now inflation for a whole year that we found out today is now up 5%. And so that means that in order to buy the same amount of stuff that you bought last year, whatever your consumer bundle is, the milk, the gasoline, the eggs. I noticed, Rich, I actually thought of you immediately when I saw that even whiskey's up 4% year over year, right? And so all that stuff, if you weigh it by how much people buy, then you can see that it's up 5%, which is a humongous increase because most people, their wages don't change that quickly. And so if prices go up 5% and their wages don't move, then they're sort of 5% worse off. And I think that that's the state that we're in right now. Over the first half of the year, that I promise not to filibuster ever again. But over the first half of the year, wages, there are a lot of different measures, but they're up a little more than 3% over the first half of the year or 5 months. And prices now are up like 6.5% over the first 5 months. And so that means the average American has seen their real wage decline by about as much as we've seen going back to the Second World War. So it's a massive negative shock for consumers.
So we'll get into that a little bit more just in a minute. Let me ask you another really elementary question. So theoretically, ideally, is it best if there's just zero inflation? That the value of a dollar stays the same, you can purchase as much goods 10 years from now as you do now, or realistically in the real world, do you want a little inflation?
Right. Well, I think that's something that there's a pretty simple answer to, which is that if inflation is steady, then we can work around it. And we'll readjust our prices. So if inflation is 2% a year or 3% a year or 4% a year, so let's just say it's 4% a year, then people expect prices to go up 4% a year. And then when they come to Rich Lowry, the writers, and they whine about their low salary, they say, hey, at least to keep up with inflation, you need to increase my salary this year by 4%. And so markets kind of adjust. They adjust quickly. A way to think about it, an example I often use when I taught this at Columbia was Disney World. Right? You've probably taken your kids to Disney World, right, Rich? I'm guessing. And you go there and you get Disney dollars, right? You give them $1 and they give you $1 with like Mickey on it. And then they accept the Disney dollars in Disney World. If they gave you 2 Mickey dollars for $1 US, that'd be massive inflation, right? But it wouldn't make you better off because what they do is they just double the price of hamburgers in Mickey dollars, right? And so that everything can sort of work out in the end. If somebody slipped you some extra Disney dollars, then and the prices didn't adjust, you'd be better off. But the prices adjust so quickly that as long as it's expected, you're okay. And so what's happening now is there's unexpected inflation. And when there's unexpected inflation, prices run ahead of wages and people get worse off. But that's why, Rich, you're too young. But when I was a little kid, it was like absolutely true that inflation was the #1 economic issue in politics. And it was because every year prices were going up faster than wages and people are getting worse off and they're getting very angry about it. And that's why we had wage and price controls. We had whip inflation now. All that kind of stuff is around the corner for us now because inflation is taking off and it's not going to be contained the way Washington policymakers are saying.
Yeah, well, I'm older than you think, Kevin. So I do have memories of gas lines. I have memories of my mom complaining, coming back to the grocery store, the price of chicken's going up and, how are we going to buy it next week? It was such a squeeze on middle-class families. So what's happening right now? Why is inflation going up at this rate?
Yeah, the inflation is going up. It's really been quite predictable. It's mostly, or a big part of it is a result of the Biden stimulus being so humongous. But what happens with inflation is that suppose that you flew around and you dropped cash out of a helicopter and everybody grabbed the cash. But cash doesn't actually give you any utility. So if you had a whole bunch of dollar bills under your bed, you might feel happy knowing you got cash in case you need it in the future. But mostly people want to take that money and use it to buy something. And so what we've done is we've helicopter dropped an enormous amount of cash out of the economy. And so demand has been skyrocketing. And you see that with like used cars, used car prices are up 30% year over year or something like that, because everybody's got all this cash, stimulus cash, and they want to buy stuff, especially durable goods. But if supply keeps up with that demand, then so suppose that you just, had like an extra, so everybody wants lots of apples, and you have a whole bunch of apple orchards that you haven't been picking from in your orchard because there wasn't that big a demand for apples. If the price goes up, then you hire more workers and you just go to those trees that you were leaving alone, you get a lot more apples. So supply could adjust and you wouldn't get much of a price response. The problem is the economy is running close to capacity. We've got unemployment insurance benefits that are encouraging people to stay home. So you can't increase output by hiring more workers. In fact, that's the number one problem in business surveys that we see is they can't find the workers. So supply is constrained on the worker side. Supply is constrained on the capital side because the Biden administration is regulating firms within an inch of their life again. And they're also promising big future tax hikes. And so you wouldn't necessarily, like if I went out and said, hey, Rich, give me your life savings, I want to build a factory. Then you would sort of say, now, hold on there, fella. Biden says he's going to lift our tax rate to, the highest on earth again. Why would I want to have a new factory? So that on the sort of factory side, you're not getting more supply. And so demand is running really ahead of supply. And the history of it is that it can turn into a really nasty spiral really fast. And here's why. So if you're looking at, say, used car prices, well, let's just suppose it's new car prices too. If they're going up 10, 15, 20% a year, then if you buy it now versus buying it in December, you're going to save yourself a lot of money, right? And so then what you do is, what we need for inflation not to spiral out of control is for supply to catch up with demand. But once consumers see inflation, then what they want to do is buy the stuff before the next round of inflation happens. And that increases demand now even more. And that's the way you could sort of get a magnifying, almost, you could call it a death spiral of accelerating inflation. Death spiral for the economy, not for inflation. And you can see that that's starting to happen. And one of the ways, so when people say, and you see that a lot of Washington policymakers are saying, hey, don't worry, it's temporary because, inflation is anchored. And then you have to ask yourself, John Cochran and I wrote a piece that someone could presumably put a link in for at National Review about this, but you have to ask yourself the question, what are they anchored to? And one thing is you could say is expectations, that people think that inflation was always 2% for the last 20 years, so it's going to stay 2%. So they don't go to Rich Lowry and say, I need a 4% wage increase because they know it's going to be 2% as soon as we get through this rough patch. But if you look at the Michigan survey, they actually asked people, what do you think inflation is going to be over the next 12 months? And that number's jumped all the way up to around 4. And so so people's expectations are not anchored. So that's not going to anchor inflation. The other thing that could anchor inflation would be belief in policymakers, but that they'll do the right thing once they see inflation. But for policymakers to do the right thing, remember, since inflation is demand running ahead of supply, then if you want to sort of stop inflation with economic policy, then what you need to do is have a big supply side tax cut, because then you increase supply a lot. And so if Biden were to come out and say, hey, let's cut the corporate tax rate to 10%, then you'd have an explosion in new capacity. You'd have a whole bunch of new supply. You'd have a hope of constraining inflation. But he's actually promising the opposite, right? And then, maybe the Fed, Jay Powell's a good friend of mine. I like him a lot. Maybe he's willing to become Paul Volcker, by the next meeting. But my guess is that the Fed is going to sort of believe that they can ride this out, that if the Fed believes it's temporary, then they're not going to start raising interest rates and start cutting back quantitative easing, which is what they would need to do beginning today if they want to get ahead of this inflationary spiral.
So Kevin, what do you say to those who are skeptical that we're heading into any sort of spiral or at serious risk of it at all, who argue, look, this is just the inevitable dynamic of the pandemic. Workers were staying at home. It's harder to ramp up production, whereas it's easier for people to start spending again. So of course we have this imbalance that's driving inflation, but it's just temporary and it's nothing to worry about.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that there's a huge amount, if you look at national savings, that basically all of us have more or less been locked in our basements for a year. And those of us who were fortunate enough not to lose our jobs have been sort of piling up cash. And now we're dying to get out and do those things we couldn't do for a year. One thing I noticed is that I had a friend who's leaving town for the summer. He said, hey, let's go out to dinner before I leave town. And I was just looking through restaurants in DC, and basically, there was like no place to get a table. Basically every table is full. So what happens is that everybody has all this cash that they want to spend, and they're running into supply constraints, and those supply constraints are driving up prices. And so the question is just, is that demand going to collapse all of a sudden. And basically, there's enough to keep like the current level or the current acceleration rate of spending. There's enough to keep that going on the demand side through at least the end of the year. And so those of you who think that you could have a year of say 5% inflation, which is what we've just had, and I think it could easily be, we're going to see year over year numbers of 7 by December, almost for sure. That you could have a year like that and then blip down to 2. The people who believe that are basically asserting that we're going to see something that we've never seen before. Because what happens is that's right now we're in the demand pull part. And so demand pull is, helicopter drop cash on people, and then they demand a lot of stuff, and that pulls prices up. But then what happens is that all those underpaid National Review writers, they're going to say, hey, Rich, Lowry, the prices went up a lot more than we thought. You need to increase my wage.
Would you stop encouraging our writers to?
Yeah, I'm just trying to help you. I'm part of the National Review Writers Union, as you know.
Been so long beating into them, they should never ask for a raise.
But as soon as Rich Lowry came, say, actually, I'm giving you a defense. So what you could do is you could say, hey, I'd increase your wage, but I'm going to start like an inflation spiral. We don't want to do that, right? So anyway, once wages go up, then you get cost push inflation because you have to raise the price of the magazine to cover all those higher wages. And then once you get the cost push, then inflation goes even higher. And then next year, the demands are even higher. And before you know it, you're looking at double-digit inflation. And then that's what happened. It started, at the beginning of the year, and as you know, this is something I've been telling people about since late last year is going to happen. At the beginning of the year, I was thinking that we're kind of like late 60s. But now things are going so fast. I think we went from late 60s to early 70s really, really quickly, faster than I expected. And there is a way out. The way out is tight monetary policy and a supply side tax cut or supply side policies, reduce regulations, make it easier for people to increase capacity. But we're doing the opposite on the supply side, on the fiscal side, and on the monetary side. I think we've got we might as well have a Federal Reserve Board of ostriches because they're just basically, I think, in denial if you look at the things that they're saying.
So Kevin, another thing that people say who are less alarmist about this as well, the Fed really screwed it up in the late 60s and the early 70s and didn't know what it's doing. We understand this phenomenon much better now. We'll be able to control it much better than we did then.
Yeah, here's a way to respond to that. And honestly, we could mutate it into, okay, so now, Mr. Smarty Pants, what would you do about it, right? But for quantitative easing, that what basically went on for the last few years, especially after the financial crisis, is that the Fed was really concerned about pegging longer-term interest rates at a lower rate because longer-term interest rates affect mortgages, car payments, things like that. And so they bought a lot of bonds. And when they bought the bonds, say from Citi, then they would increase the reserve account for Citi at the Federal Reserve, which is basically just something in the Fed computers. And so Citi would give them $1 million bond. The Fed would say, you got $1 million more in your reserves. And the regulators would say, hey, Citi, don't lend those reserves to anybody because we're really worried about your stability, and not just Citi, everybody. And so the money kind of went into the Fed's basement and then it's stuck there. What's happening now is that the Treasury has to sell a heck of a lot of debt because of this massive deficit spending. And to put it in perspective, government spending this year relative to GDP is going to be about the level it was in 1943, Rich, 1943. So we're looking at, we need to have war bonds. That's how much spending we got. But we're issuing those bonds and we're not like running ads for Rosie the Riveter or anything. Instead, the Fed's just buying it all. But instead of it going into like a bank's reserve account, what's really happening, although they do have to do it through an intermediary, is the Fed's buying Treasury bonds and depositing the money in the Treasury's general account. And then the Treasury is transferring the money to taxpayers. And so it is kind of like a helicopter drop. We're printing money and giving it to people and saying, go out there and spend. And so like a family of 4, the amount of cash they've gotten from the government is about, say, 10%, median family of 4, about 10% of their income. And so you could almost think it's like this, that the government is saying, go out, don't do anything super unusual, but go out and buy whatever you want with this credit card for the next month, and we'll pay the bill. Right. So if you do something like that, what's going to happen to prices? And that's what we're doing. that's the way to think about the economics of what we're doing. And that's why, you probably noticed over the years that Larry Summers and I've known Larry since I was in graduate school. He was very kind to me when I was in grad school. But Larry and I often disagree about stuff, but he and I totally agree about this, that we're in a, potential inflationary spiral. And if we don't act soon, it's going to have to be really ugly to end it.
So Kevin, let me get to some questions from our chat box. And again, folks, feel free to jump in here, throw anything you're wondering about, any comments or questions. So Raymond asked, do inflation measures account for things like packages getting smaller, but the price of the package staying the same? Is it sensitive at that level of detail?
Yeah, the folks who developed the Consumer Price Index, they have thought of just about everything. And not everything. My good friend and colleague at Hoover, Mike Boskin, led a commission, the Boskin Commission, which people could Google, that looked at what the Consumer Price Index, how it was calculated, and then thought about whether it was missing anything significant. Even back then, what they found was the Consumer Price Index was underestimating inflation by about 1%. And that's sort of like a consistent thing. So all these years when we said we've got inflation stable at 2, really probably it was about at 3. I don't know if when the Boston Commission was writing, if they were accounting for this thing. The question is something that my wife tells me about a lot, that she notices that I don't, like that there are fewer Fig Newtons in a package or something like that. I'm too clueless. I just want my Fig Newton. I think that packages are getting smaller. It's one of the ways that people constrain prices, but the CPI people are clever enough. They responded a lot to the criticism of the Boston's Commission. And so they do a lot of things to adjust. They even do something called, if people want to look up the phrase, hedonic adjustment, HEDONIC, which accounts for the fact that, stuff gets better. And so, like if you have a car, like my Chevy Nova from the 70s, right. And you compare that to, a Chevy Impala today, there's a gazillion things in the Impala that you couldn't even have bought in the 70s. Right. And so therefore, like if you were to try to buy today's Impala in the 70s, you'd have had to be a billionaire practically, right? And so they even account for that kind of stuff in the price.
So again, that inflation rate of 2% or whatever it was, 3%, that's okay as long as that's what they expect, that's what they're used to. The problem you get is when we're chasing the tail of this higher level of inflation.
Right. And there's one other thing that it might feel like it's in the weeds. It's actually kind of an interesting metric of like how the economy has adjusted over time to Feds being pretty good at controlling inflation in the past, is that in 1997, I wrote a paper with co-authors Glenn Hubbard and Daryl Cohen for Marty Feldstein, actually, God rest his soul, asked us to write this paper for a book that he published. But if you go to the National Bureau of Economic Research website and Google Kevin Hassett, Daryl Cohen, and Glenn Hubbard, and maybe one of our staff people that are listening can then put that up. We wrote a paper about the impact of inflation on the economy. And the title was approximately, Does Inflation Still Matter in 97? And we found that it did. And so the reason I just did this little digression is that the higher inflation that you have, the more you get negative impulses from taxes, because taxes don't recognize the difference between real and nominal gains. And so if there's, if I sell something in January versus December of a year, then in December I'm selling it, and because of inflation, my dollar's worth a lot less, or to keep up with inflation, it looks like I made a lot of profit, but I didn't really. I was just keeping up with inflation. And that inflationary profit is taxed by the IRS. But also when companies buy things, like say you build a building, then you get to depreciate that over 37 years or so. And with inflation, the value of future deductions declines every year. And so so basically it's like having an increased tax on capital formation to have inflation, because the tax code doesn't differentiate between nominal and real. And so there are a lot of negative effects of higher inflation rates that work through the tax code.
So someone asked, is it possible to have high inflation but low interest rates, which I guess is what we have now?
Yeah, I mean that's where we are right now, but I don't think that it's an equilibrium that one should expect. But it's basically right now what's going on is there's so much central bank intervention that interest rates aren't consistent with economic models, that they're way too low, and at some point the central banks are going to run out of ability to peg interest rates. And again, there have been signs of auctions that almost failed in the U.S., or times when the Treasury wants to sell $100 worth of bonds, and in order to sell it, the Fed has to buy $150 worth of bonds because we lose some customers when they see that we have to sell the 100. And so basically, you mentioned at the outset that I work with Larry Lindsay at Larry's consulting firm, and we've done some simulations of like what share of GDP of government debt that the Fed's going to own over the next decade. And we have reasonable simulations that are not low probability that have the Fed owning almost 100% of GDP in government debt, because the Fed is basically the residual customer for all this stuff. And again, if the Fed does that and then like buries the reserves in somebody's account in the basement, then you're not going to get a lot of inflation. But if the Fed is basically just financing deficits, so they're putting the money in the Treasury's general account, the Fed kind of runs the checking account for the Treasury. If the Fed puts money in the checking account for the Treasury, then the government can just spend it on whatever it wants. And that's what's going on right now. And when that happens, then the cash that the Fed produces is going out there and chasing goods, and then you get inflation.
So Greg asks, doesn't inflation create massive wealth destruction for those who save money in cash assets, CDs, et cetera? Took years for people obviously to build up these savings. Why does government allow it to destroy them in this manner?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And so if you've got your cash under your mattress, then inflation is really, really bad. If you're a fixed income person, then inflation is really, really bad. It's definitely going to have a negative effect on your welfare. If you're a person who's living on their Social Security, then that's adjusted for inflation. And so if inflation is suddenly 5%, then people's Social Security payments will go up by 5%. And so that there is some indexing out there. Social Security, thankfully, is indexed. And actually, if you think about it, if inflation is suddenly 5%, now I'm making a sort of subtle economist point, but if inflation is 5% and your Social Security goes up by 5%, then you might actually even be a little better off, because the reason inflation is measured at 5% is, say, because gasoline went up so much in price, just say. And then if we give you 5% more Social Security, then if you drive less, then you've got more money for other stuff, right? And then you might actually come out ahead if you respond to the higher prices. And if milk goes up, but almond milk doesn't, then you switch to almond milk, and the extra money is you can keep in your pocket. It is something to think about.
Another question: wasn't May 2020 a point of low economic activity, and then likely low prices? So wouldn't it be better to compare where we are now to, say, January 2020 or some earlier date?
Yeah, that's another really good point. And so one of the things about what we call year over year comparisons, which are the numbers that I've been citing, is that it depends on what was going on a year ago. And so a year ago, we were in the middle of shutdowns. And that'll be true really for this year's comparison and next year's comparison too. But one way you can sort of account for that is to look at month to month changes now, because we're definitely above where we were, before the COVID pandemic crisis began. And so wherever we go from here, that's like a metric of the trajectory. And so the March to April percent change, and then if you want to put it in annual rate, you could approximately multiply it by 12. But I won't make you do that in front of everybody, Rich, because I know that's too hard. But
maybe I can multiply it by 2.
But so the March to April increase in all items consumer price index was 0.8%, right? So that multiply that by 12 and you get just about to 10% annual rate. And this year, this month, it was 0.6. And so if you multiply, that by 12, then you're north of 7. And even if you go to core, right? So people said, oh, well, energy prices are skyrocketing, so we should ignore that. I don't agree with that, because energy prices, that sort of implicitly implies that prices are going to go back down for energy. But if you look at the Biden administration policies towards energy, they're designed to make energy prices go up. And so certainly higher prices over the next 3 or 4 years, are something that, should be on everybody's radar. But multiply these by 12, Rich, the core CPI, which excludes energy and food, so from March to April, 0.9. Okay, so that means inflation is about 10%, north of 10%, 11%, and this month, 0.7. So you multiply, right? So this is a number that should be 0.1 or 0.2 if you're not worried about inflation. And I have to add that the numbers are way worse than that, even because exactly, I'll look it up. 32.857%, that's the actual number, of the consumer bundle is housing in the consumer price index. But the housing numbers, after praising them, I can criticize them a little bit, are just made up. They're not real numbers. And so the rate of housing inflation right now in the data is basically for rent, it's 1.8%. For owner occupied housing, it's 2.1%. So it's about 2%. The reason it looks like it's 2% is that the numbers are not, they're made up. They just pulled them out of a hat. And so, but those numbers that I just read you are held down by the fact that the BLS has unacceptably low inflation measures for housing. To put that in perspective, the Case-Shiller, the last reading I looked at, it might be a month after this, but the last reading for Case-Shiller showed that housing prices in the US were up year over year 13%.
Yeah.
If you put
what's
that
been going on all over the country, people even cities that 2% doesn't sound right. Even I know that, Kevin.
Yeah, I know, but think about it this way. So if you look at core CPI excluding housing this month, it increased. So again, the all items less food and energy is 3.8%. If you throw out shelter, it's 5%. If you assume shelter kept up with the housing price data that we have, then core CPI at an annual rate right now is increasing at about 9%. 9%. And so you can sort of say, wait, that seems like too big a number, but let's do some simple math. I know everybody's here because they love to do math. That's why people logged it. And so think about it this way. Suppose that we're at a relatively full employed economy, and then all of a sudden you give everybody 10% more cash. And if you look at the $2 trillion stimulus in a 20 trillion economy, that's about what we just did. So if you give everybody 10% more cash, then if supply can't respond at all and everybody decides they're going to buy anyway, then prices just go up by 10%, right? They just, so basically you don't get more real output, but you get more nominal output, and it's basically prices just go up to eat the extra cash. And so that 10% number is sort of, you can think of as a bound of what happens if you have no supply response. Well, we just rained 10% cash on people, and prices right now are going up 9%. And so, what's the sort of Econ 101 explanation for that? Demand's going up, supply's not, and the scale is even just about what you'd expect if that's the story.
So let me just mention, we have a ton of questions. Unfortunately, there's no way I'm getting to all of them. So if I don't get to your question, it's not because I didn't like your question or don't like you. It's just that there's a lot of interest in this topic. So going back to history, Kevin, someone asked, so how was the inflation in the 70s solved? Was this basically just Volcker at the Fed crushing it down, or were there other policy responses that made a difference?
I think that Volcker was an important part of it, but that that Keynesians who support big government and big government spending and so on have exaggerated Volcker's effect on inflation in order to take credit away from Reagan. But if folks and not everyone has to do this, but I bet you that there's at least two folks that are willing to close their eyes and think about supply demand space, that chart you had when you were taking your economics class in high school or college, that if you shift demand curve out, then you go up the supply curve and then prices go higher. If you shift demand curve out, then you go up the supply curve to get more output and prices are higher. If you then shift the supply curve back, which is what Biden's doing, then you might not end up with more output, but you end up with really higher prices because they go up when the demand curve goes up and then they go up when the supply curve goes up. Well, what Reagan did is he had a positive supply shock. So supply increased a lot because of the Reagan tax cuts. And that put downward pressure on prices at the same time that Volcker was trying to stop inflation. And so you really need a bundle of monetary and fiscal policy to fix this. And the way to do it is to have a big supply shock, positive supply shock. And you can do that in a fiscally responsible way. And there's a literature, Matt Jensen and I have a paper that we wrote on lessons from fiscal consolidations that worked. Maybe our crack team can find that and put a link up as well. But what you would do is fix the deficit in the long run by doing things like changing the long run Medicare and Social Security policies, make the US better off in the long run fiscally, and then use some of that money to have a supply shock today. And if you do that, then you could get inflation under control. The problem is that I don't really see the Democrats doing anything that's like a positive supply shock between now, and the next presidential election. And so therefore, the Fed going it alone isn't really going to do the job. You're going to have inflation that's, much higher than the 2%, much higher than the 2% that people say.
And how will rising inflation affect the stock market?
That's something that if you go back and look, that it's, there's a lot of there are a lot of different results. But the background medium-term result is that, that if there's inflation, then that means that the prices of stuff that businesses sell are going up. If the prices of stuff that businesses sell are going up, then the businesses are kind of keeping up with inflation, right? But it's actually a little bit better than that for the firms when there's an inflation spiral. And that's because wages are sticky, right? Like you don't have to deal with all these workers that I've just lit a fire under until like January when you're negotiating next year's salaries, right? And so they're going to lose ground to inflation this year and then in January try to make it up. And so wages are sticky, prices aren't that sticky. And so firms are going to be in this period where their prices are going up, but the wages they pay their workers aren't going up as much. And so very labor intensive firms are going to actually see positive profit shocks and definitely will keep up with inflation. So equities generally are a way better place to be than bonds when this is happening. The argument against that, though, is, and gosh, we're doing way too much math today, but you could think about if I gave you $1 a year forever, then the present value of that, it's like an old result that at some point people who did power series expansions in their high school class would have learned. But the value of that is about 1 over the interest rate. And so if the interest rate's 10% and you get $1 a year forever, then you ought to be willing to pay $10 for that today to get $1 a year forever with a 10% interest rate. And so the problem with that is that as the interest rate gets close to zero, then 1 over the interest rate goes to infinity. And so and it gets pretty nonlinear. And so with interest rates really, really low, equity prices are really high now because the discount rates are so low that future cash is worth a lot more. But if the Fed decides it's going to do something about inflation and it starts lifting up the interest rate, then that's going to be really bad for equities because you're discounting future cash flows with a much bigger number. And the discount rate effect when the Fed starts to act is so big that it will dominate the profit effect that I discussed. But between now and then, and assuming that markets are going to expect that the Fed's not going to be rough, then equities should be okay.
So related question, should we expect to see investors running to hedge against inflation via real estate, commodities, gold, et cetera? Is that already happening? And if so, are those investments then, quote, overbought?
Yes, that's exactly what you should do. So you should basically be moving towards real assets. And real assets are inflation hedges. And there are a lot of pretty reasonable inflation hedges that aren't that risky. One of the ones that I myself use, I don't give investment advice. So people should study this for themselves and decide whether it's right for them. But one of the things that I've done is I've moved a lot of my bonds into things like utility stocks. Because basically, utilities, they have, regulated prices, their costs go up, then their prices go up. and they have a kind of guaranteed rate of return, sort of like a bond, but it's a bond that keeps up with inflation. And so if you're worried about inflation, then fewer bonds and more things like utilities are a good way to go.
So someone asks, what stops the central banks from just keep printing money, and why can't they buy treasuries forever? And takeaway from this question: do you believe in modern monetary theory?
The Fed can't keep this up forever. Pretty much, if the Treasury is borrowing a lot and borrowing so much that the global marketplace isn't really willing to purchase the U.S. debt, and then the Fed has to step in, then you're going to start to be in the kind of spiral we've seen in South America or Weimar Germany. It's just you're basically throwing cash after stuff. It's probably the case given the current state of massive demand stimulus with a big contraction in supply. So let's assume that the Biden corporate tax proposal passes in the fall, and that the Fed policy stays where it is. Probably the best place to put your money is in companies that make wheelbarrows, because you're going to need that to get a loaf of bread.
Great. Okay, here's an interesting one. In some ways, the current situation in the U.S. resembles Japan: high deficits, high personal savings rates, declining workforce, very low interest, etc. But Japan has had no inflation. What's the difference?
Yeah. So in Japan, there's a very high savings rate, and the debt is very much held in postal savings accounts. And so pretty much everybody's bank keeps their money in a bank account that's at the post office, which is run by the government. And so when the U.S. right now sells a bond to the Fed, then the Fed takes the money. They can't sell directly to the Fed, so they sell it to a bank. The bank sells it to the Fed. But eventually, what happens is $1 worth of bonds. The Fed buys it and puts $1 in the Treasury's checking account, is the way to think about it. And when the Japanese government sells $1 worth of bonds, then it's purchased by some grandmother, and it goes into her postal savings account. And basically, she doesn't spend it on anything. They have a very low marginal propensity to consume in Japan, very, very high savings rate. And so Japan's been able to run deficits bigger than our own for a long time, and the money is not sitting in a reserve account of a bank in the basement at the Fed. It's sitting at the postal office savings account of a person, and not chasing goods. And so again, the way to think about it is that when the Fed turns the knob to buy a bond, and turns the knob on a reserve account or turns the knob on a savings account, then the extra reserves cause inflation if they're put in somebody's checking account and then chase after goods. And so if the Fed turns the knob, buys a bond, and somebody's got more reserves or more in their postal savings account, and then that money doesn't chase a good, then you can get away with no inflation.
So Kevin, very important question that many of us have been wondering about who have been on this call. What's the deal with the rooster?
Yeah, the rooster.
Right-hand shoulder.
Yeah, it's just, our family has lots of collections of weird ceramic critters, and we have them scattered throughout the house. And that rooster is a very close family member. Never graduated high school, but earns his keep by protecting the kitchen table.
All right, so we at least have one other version of this question that I've seen in the chat box. Question: U.S. 10-year Treasury is now at 1.465%! Exclamation point. Why is the market reacting in this fashion to an annualized CPI now of 5%?
Yeah. And I think it's basically, there's a lot of faith that the Fed can continue to buy this stuff, and that you're not going to run into, anything that's problematic. But there are other things that you can see in the data that suggest that, things are starting to get out of control. I'm looking at my computer just because I want to pull up the link so I can post it for you guys. But I think it's here. Here we go. Yeah, so that the, got it now. So that the Minnesota Fed looks at futures markets and they tell you what are the odds that futures markets have priced in of different future expected levels of inflation. And one of the things that they do is they look at, because basically if there's if you're buying an option, then if it's out of the money, then that means that there's nobody in the market that thinks that there's any reasonable probability that the price gets that high or that low. And in last year, in the middle of the shutdown, the probability that was priced into markets that the consumer price index year ahead inflation would be below 1% was 40% about. And right now, the probability, no, it's actually 80%. I'm sorry, I read off the wrong axis. And so right now, the probability that this year, the year ahead consumer price index will be below 1%. And this is like all of financial markets, is almost zero. Last year at this time, the odds that consumer price index would be above 3% for the year ahead was about zero. And again, all this stuff is available at the website of the Minneapolis Fed. The odds right now, after today's report, that the consumer price index will be above 3% over the next 12 months is 80%, or are 80%. And so if you look at like across all financial markets, it's very obvious that the markets are now pricing in inflation above, 80% chance of inflation above 3%. And so then you can say, well, if prices are going to be above 3% with 80% chance, how could the 10-year rate be a little under 1.5? And the answer is it's price fixing. The Fed is fixing that price with purchases. And the Fed's kind of the only customer almost buying at that price. And how long can the Fed fix those prices? Well, at some point the Fed's going to have to wake up. So imagine, here's a way to put it in perspective. If you look at the Fed's forecast for inflation for this year last December, or the Biden White House's forecasts for inflation for this year of a little bit north of 2%, we've already hit that this year. If prices are flat for the rest of the year, then we'll have about hit the Fed's and the White House's forecast for inflation for the whole year. And so if prices go up at the rate they're going up right now, then by September, it's going to be obvious that inflation's north of 5-6%. And they're going to have to act. And the way they're going to have to act is they're going to have to let market prices go to where market prices belong. But the person who asked that question was exactly right, that it's just not sustainable to have an inflation rate, right now, 80% chance that it's above 3 over the next year, and to have an interest rate that's below 3%, because you're locking in a negative real gain. And just to put that final thought in perspective, that if you just hold cash, if you go and you get cash, then you're going to lose to inflation. You're going to lose to inflation. But if you buy a real asset, then you should keep up with inflation. And so if markets are saying, there's going to be inflation of 3%, then what you would expect is that people would be moving from nominal assets to real assets. And that's why equity prices are so high. Because again, like for equities, their prices go up with inflation. And so if you're really nervous about it, sell your nominal bond and buy the stock market, and you're hedged against inflation. And so you're seeing it in market prices everywhere, except for the place where the Fed's fixing the prices.
Another question, Kevin. Are the supplemental unemployment benefits functioning as a, quote, stealth increase in the minimum wage, forcing employers to pay more to hire and retain workers, and hence driving up the cost of goods and services? If so, why might we get some relief when these payments end?
I think this is kind of a trick question, Rich, because you and I have talked about this, but let's put you on the spot. So we had a financial crisis. The unemployment rate went up a lot. 2008, it really started. And then really, I think unwisely, the Obama administration extended unemployment insurance benefits in 2009 to 99 weeks, so that people could basically stay unemployed for 99 weeks, 2 years-ish, and get unemployment benefits instead of having to go back to work. When did the expanded unemployment insurance benefits finally get repealed? Do you remember?
Under Obama? I don't.
Yeah, it was 2014.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and you say, well, why would they keep those benefits going all the way to 2014? And the answer is that I'm, a effective partisan Democrat, and Rich is a, classically buffoonish Republican elected official. And I'm going to go out there and say, there's all these unemployed people, the poor, starving, unemployed people, they need expanded benefits. And then Rich is going to say, no, they don't. We're actually just paying them not to work. And then I'm going to say, well, Rich, you're taking the food out of the mouths of starving babies, and then you're going to cave. And that's why the UI benefits extended all the way to 2014. And if you go back and look, it was about the slowest recovery ever. People never went back to work because they had the benefits. Clearly there's an empirical link between the two. And now we're going to go down that road again. So I think that when the expiration happens in September, that they're going to extend it, through the next election, be my bet. In there's one more bill they get to do with reconciliation, right? And if that one doesn't have, I'll buy you dinner at your favorite restaurant in New York, Rich, if that doesn't have expanded UI benefits. And so what that does is, and this is somebody who really knows their economics asks the question, is that it raises what we call the reservation wage. Right. So the reservation wage is the wage that you have to pay me more than if you're going to get me to show up at work. So the reservation wage is basically what it's worth to me in utility terms to stay home and, play Xbox or whatever. And, plus how much cash I get from the government if I'm just hanging out at home. And an employer and all these employers who have these jobs that aren't filled, if they want to get people to come to work, they have to pay them more than their reservation wage. And for sure, the unemployment insurance benefit will factor into that calculation. When we were at CEA, when I was back at the White House last year, we did an estimate of the impact of that. And last year, the expanded benefit didn't really have much effects on this because basically firms were ordered to shut down and people were ordered to stay at home. And so that the expanded benefit was just a humane, reasonable response to the terrible economic and human tragedy of last year. But now, people they're vaccinated, they should get back to work. And the expanded benefit is just helping people stay home and helping supply stay constrained, leading to the inflationary spiral that we're talking about. And so I would, frankly, I would end it early if I could. I've participated in this space a lot in policy terms, and I've written over the years in National Review about this topic a lot. And one of the things that people could do right now, and Senator Jack Reed, a Democrat from Rhode Island, is a sort of very intellectual guy on economic policy at times, and he taught economics at West Point, and he has a proposal to expand something I've worked with him on over the years called work sharing, where basically right now you get 100% of your unemployment insurance if you don't have a job. But Jack Reed led, and it made it into law, but it's kind of a minor program. He wants to expand it a lot. A program that said, well, if you go back and work half-time, then you get to keep half of your unemployment insurance benefit. And if you go back, 20%, then you get 80% of your unemployment insurance benefit. But the thing about this work sharing proposal of Senator Reed's, it's a really great idea, and I hope it gets bipartisan support, is it reconnects people to the labor force. And so right now, if you're worried you're going to lose your benefit in September, then getting back part-time right now to make sure you have a job when your benefit's up is a way to gradually ramp back up to being a contributing member of society. And the work, so what I would do is I would expand work sharing according to the proposal of Senator Jack Reed in order to fix that problem.
Did you see, and Kevin, we just have a couple minutes left, did you see the astonishing story today about half the enhanced unemployment benefits over the last year being stolen?
I read that story. The number seems high to me, but here's why it's possible, but I've not studied it, and so it could be it's true. I don't know. But the reason it's possible goes back to when we were negotiating, and I was back at the White House, and we were negotiating the Phase 3 stimulus bill. Basically, the average unemployment insurance benefit in the U.S. was about $400 a week. But the average salary in the U.S. was about $1,000 a week. And we were telling everybody they couldn't go to work for, say, it ended up being like 45 days, something like that. But we're saying you can't go to work. And so I think that everybody thought and the task force was telling us we're going to follow the path of Italy. And so by the summer, the cases would be way down and we could reopen up and so on. As everybody thought that what we need to do is make everybody whole until we reopen in the summer. That was the idea behind the stimulus bill of this or April, May range. And so what we wanted to do is basically just have the unemployment insurance benefit be grossed up to whatever your salary was. And so if you're a person who made $600 and you're only getting $400, you get $200. If you're a person making $1,100, and you're getting $400, then you get $700 and so on. But we were told by the Democrats that it's impossible to do that because the state unemployment insurance programs are run by like 1950s computers or something, and that the computers wouldn't be able to match the benefit to people's incomes. And so that's why, do you remember it was $600? Where the $600 came from was that the average person was 1,000 and the average payment was 400, and we were trying to get back to 1,000. And we decided that we couldn't vary the payment by individual because the programs were so archaic. The reason I mention that is that if the system's so archaic that it can't match the benefit, make the benefit a function of somebody's income, then it's probably one that's susceptible to fraud as well. And so while I haven't checked the exact numbers, given how bad the unemployment insurance programs are for some states, it's possible they're that bad. And finally, because we did study this a lot, and so it turned out, by the way, so therefore the Democrats who said this to us, they were correct at the beginning. By the end, I thought we fixed it and they didn't agree, but at the beginning, they were correct. But the final thought about that is just that there's no partisan pattern in this. So the old-fashioned computers that plague the unemployment insurance system are about equally distributed across red and blue states. So there are a bunch of states that do it really well, that have modernized, and a bunch of states that haven't, and they're sort of equally distributed across, red and blue states.
So Kevin, two real quick lightning round style questions. One from the chat box, which asks you to put on your pundit hat and predict whether Biden will get his tax increases or not. And then I'll throw in on top of that, do we need an infrastructure bill, and will there be an infrastructure bill?
Sure. So infrastructure first. The infrastructure bill is looking unlikely now. And so the fact that the parliamentarians said they can't pass it with reconciliation means that they have to get Republican votes. And given how partisan Biden and the team have been, again, last year, you might have noticed, like you probably didn't, Rich, but you might have noticed that the Democrats weren't super fond of Donald Trump. Remember that? And yet, he passed bipartisan stimulus bills really 4 times, right? And then Biden comes in and says, oh, we're going to go back to being nice to one another, kumbaya. And then they jam through this stimulus that's so big that it's causing this inflationary spiral without any Republican votes. And so my guess is that the Republicans are going to, basically run a kind of stall offense. We used to call it a 4-corner offense. They'll pass the ball around. They'll pretend they're going to negotiate and then try to eat up all the time between now and the August break and then bail. Unless the Democrats actually make a really good bill that attracts them. I mean, they're honorable people, want to make the country a better place.
But there could
so it's 50-50 on stimulus, but on tax hikes, it's like 100%.
On infrastructure. So there could in theory be an infrastructure bill that would be worth having.
Yes, there definitely could be a $1 trillion one that I would tell everyone you should do. I mean, basically, we're borrowing money right now at almost 0 interest rate in the US. We're still getting away with it. And if we invest in very high return things like making it so there's less traffic on the I-95 corridor, then that'll absolutely improve the economy and have a rate of return that exceeds the cost of finance. It's another place where Larry Summers and I agree. There's a lot of infrastructure stuff that completely makes sense. And the good thing about infrastructure too is that it spreads the government demand out over the next few years. And so one of the problems we have is government spending to GDP this year is going to be about 31%. And under the current policy baseline, it drops to 21% next year. That's a 10% reduction in government spending relative to GDP. That's the kind of thing that causes a recession, even if you're not a Keynesian. And so having something like infrastructure that helps you ramp down from this huge spending that we've been doing, in part because we had to because of COVID, it's a sensible thing to do. So yeah, I would, depending on the design, I would absolutely support some kind of infrastructure. But going to the taxes, I think that the tax hike is one of those religious things for Democrats. That, you know, the Bush tax cuts were evil, the Trump tax cuts are evil, you know, everything that reduces a marginal tax rate is, you know, basically there because, you know, people who have sold their souls to the rich people who give them campaign contributions just want lower taxes for their constituents. I mean, that's kind of the Democrats' story. And it's such an indelible part of their, you know, political mantra that it feels impossible that they won't pass a big tax hike on the rich in the fall. And, you know, I would guess that when they finish, corporate taxes are going to be higher than they were when Trump took office, higher than they were when Obama left office, that capital gains rates are going to be higher, and that the individual income tax rate is going to go back up, you know, maybe 3, 4, 5% at the top. All
right. Well, on that cheery note, Kevin, this was awesome. Thanks so much for your time. Let's do a little less math next time. Okay. It's just
I don't know if I can say yes, but we could let the rooster have more time next time.
But this was tremendous. And everyone, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for your interest. Thanks for all the questions. Sorry I couldn't get to all of them. Thanks to NRI for sponsoring this. And please read Kevin and many others at Capital Matters every day. See you, everyone.